Now, one of the results of this colonization process that began with the Spanish is the transatlantic slave trade. Um, Understand that slaves will eventually be brought over to the New World as a source of labor. All right, they're brought over to work the fields to, again, as I mentioned earlier, kind of create a civilizational way that will allow the Spanish to continue to explore. All right, these colonies, these settlements um, need to have a large labor group to help be established. Well, the explorers who are looking for this gold, and again, that's mainly the Spanish's focus is this gold and making money. Um, they don't have time to be growing crops or building houses or whatever it might be. So this slave trade begins, as you see here on the western coast of Africa, all right, and it'll be brought over. Most slaves throughout slavery's existence will be sent to Central and South America. North America will get a small number, a small percentage of slaves. Now, later, when the slave trade becomes illegal, a lot of slaves from the West Indies and Central America will be sold illegally through the black market of Louisiana and in the Deep South. Just some points of interest when we talk about the slave trade. Not necessarily extremely important, but understand that slavery and slave trade existed in Africa well before the Europeans. Africans would fight each other and take prisoners of war and made them slaves and then sometimes sell them back. But eventually what will happen is the Portuguese are going to replace European slaves, which were prisoners of war. They're going to replace them with African slaves. All right. Um, and this especially occurs with some of the islands off the coast of Portugal and off the coast of Africa and off the coast of Spain as they develop sugar plantations, and especially in the Bahamas, sugar becomes actually it's the first cash crop, not tobacco, but it becomes the first cash crop for Europeans. Okay. And you see here the first boatload of African slaves were brought by the Spanish in 1518, about 100 years before the English were bringing the first Africans to North America. Uh, in total, about 275,000 enslaved Africans will be exported. And then between 16th century and the 19th century, about 10 million Africans will be shipped to the Americas. That's North, South, and Central America. Now, when we talk about the slave trade, and this is a concept again that we're going to talk about a lot all the way through the Civil War, obviously, but when we talk about the actual slave trade, the passage from Africa to the Americas is called the Middle Passage. Okay, you obviously have the capture, which was done mostly by Africans themselves that were entrepreneurs, so they would go in and capture other Africans, bring them to the coast of Africa, and sell them to Europeans. Okay, Europeans, in this case the Spanish or the Portuguese, would pack them onto these slave ships, kind of like sardines. Okay, on the ship they would be spooning pretty much for the whole 6 to 9 week journey. They'll be in this kind of position where they're spooning, and yes, most of the time they're naked. And in the process, somebody might die, but about once a week the Spanish, or the slave traders I should say, will bring the slaves up above board and give them fresh water. They'll try to let them get some fresh air, and then they discard or get rid of any dead slaves that might have died from diseases or whatever might be the case. Okay. Now, when we talk about the European empires, by the 1600s, you see Spanish pretty much have entrenched themselves in Central America and South America. Okay, the British the British and French, I should say, will eventually take North America. All right. Now, and I'm kind of putting this up here, when we talk about the Spanish Empire and the New World, that is the first empire, and they do kind of lay the groundwork for the French and the British and how to administer the their colonies in the New World. First, the Spanish are going to create what's called the encomida, or forced labor system. They're not going to, as I already mentioned, spend time working the fields or construction themselves. So they're going to take the natives and use them at first as their forced labor. Once they realize that the natives have such a weak immunity, they're going to then result in African slaves. All right, and we'll get into a little bit later on that transition into African slaves. All right. The other thing that occurs is that the Spanish are going to create what's called the Council of the Indies. All right, it's kind of like a bureaucratic agency set up to just filter laws and decisions by the king and queen to the colonies. All right. Here they create a viceroy, which is kind of like a governor, so to speak, and then with that, they create New Spain and New Peru, which is kind of their territory, so to speak. They're large territories, but it's their territories. Now, one difference between the Spanish Empire and the British and French empires is the Pope and the role of the Catholic Church. Obviously, the Spanish are heavily Catholic, as the French are too, but they're not as controlled by the Pope. But the Spanish, they take a lot of orders from the Pope. And so when the Portuguese begin to complain about an unfair monopoly by the Spanish of the New World, the Portuguese kind of go crying to the Pope, who then comes up with a treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which kind of, they make this line here, and you see it's in yellow all the way down, and they say everything west of the line is the Spanish and everything east of the line is the Portuguese. Well, obviously the Portuguese are pretty small, so therefore they don't need that much territory as is. All right. Now, in terms of the Spanish day-to-day administering or governing of the New World, they were rather cruel and harsh to the natives, especially those who wouldn't convert to Catholicism or maybe falsely converted to Catholicism. And what happened was one of the religious missionaries was led by a gentleman named Father Bartolome de las Casas, and we'll actually do a little reading on his writings tomorrow, but he documents the harsh treatment of the natives, all right, and he sends this letter back to the king and queen, and with the style of writing that he uses and his influence within the Catholic Church, he's able to persuade the king and queen to create a new set of laws in 1542. All right, but it definitely is the first documentation of the European treatment towards the natives as being a negative one. All right. Now, one of the results, we're almost finished here, but one of the results of this exploration, definitely in the New World, is new colonial rivalries. All right, Portugal, as I mentioned before, it's rather small, so they lack the numbers and wealth to dominate trade. And meanwhile, Spain, even though they have wealth and stuff, they're kind of late getting into Asia. So what Spain decides to do is they're going to consolidate their holdings in Asia just within the Philippine Islands. That way they can focus their attention on the New World. All right, they're the first to get to the New World, so therefore they want to reap the benefits of it before the French or the British get there. All right. Eventually, the English will get to the Indies or the Bahamas, and in 1591, almost 100 years after the Spanish. So the Spanish definitely have enough time to reap those benefits that they discover. All right. So you see here this map, it's kind of crazy, but you see there's 5 major players when it comes to European trade and exploration: the British and the French, all right, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch. All right. Now the Portuguese and the Dutch are rather small, but the Dutch, even though they're small, they're the wealthiest of the group. All right, and you see here all the territories again: Asia, hot commodity, and then eventually the New World is going to become pretty important. Now, I do want to direct your attention to the right corner of this map here is triangular trade. All right. Again, we kind of talked about this early, but understand, and maybe even I would write this down, how the triangular trade occurs. Americas are going to send raw materials to Europe in return for manufactured goods. Europe is also going to send manufactured goods to Africa, mainly guns and such, and then they're going to buy slaves from Africa that will be brought to Americas to help produce more raw materials. All right, so that's an important concept that definitely play a role in the British Empire. In fact, it will play a major role in the American Revolution and eventually even Civil War in some ways. I believe this is the last slide, but this is probably important to take note. One, native populations are going to be ravaged by disease. And we'll talk later on, actually, post-Civil War, when we talk about the end of the native tribes and stuff. And we'll talk about the first genocide. Isn't necessarily Adolf Hitler, but it's the Europeans towards the natives and how the native populations are going to be destroyed by the Europeans. All right. Also, an impact is the influx of gold and silver is going to create this inflationary economic climate in Europe, which then will lead to further wars, like the 100-Year War, the 7 Years' War, etc., etc. And then new products, we talked about that. We'll spend some time tomorrow looking at this Columbian Exchange. And then last but not least is the deepened colonial rivalries. All right, thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow.